I invite the Leader of the Victorian Greens to speak to the motion.
Thank you, Speaker. To begin, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation whose lands this Parliament sits, and pay my respect to Elders past and present, and to all First Nations people here today and across the land we now call Victoria. It is a deep privilege to stand here today to add my voice to the apology to First Nations peoples for the wrongs inflicted upon them by the state and the colony of Victoria by the colonisation of their home, of your home. Speaker, when I was growing up, there was a lot of talk about reconciliation. But as we know from so many post-war healing processes around the world, true reconciliation can only come after truth and justice. And to move forward, we must deeply and honestly reckon with the past. And this apology today is part of that reckoning. So it is my privilege and honour to stand here on behalf of all Greens MPs and members, on behalf of our constituents and the Victorians we are elected to represent, to apologise to the First Nations people of so-called Victoria for the deep harms, the dispossession, the trauma and the genocide that was perpetrated by our ancestors against yours. To say clearly and loudly and solemnly, I am sorry, we are sorry for the injustices of the past, the decisions that were made in this building, which we know still have deep impacts in the present. And I want to acknowledge everyone in the gallery today and watching online for your generosity at being here today for this apology. I know the apology will mean different things to different people. For some, the state government finally admitting and officially acknowledging the wrongs of the past will be a deeply healing event. For others, the meaning of the apology will be in the action or inaction that comes after it. In preparing for this speech, I reflected on the immense work of the Europe Justice Commission and all those who shared their stories over 5 years. The evidence was laid out clear and undeniable about the true history of how most of us came to live in so-called Victoria. And it is not easy reading, but nothing changes the facts, no matter how uncomfortable we may find them. And it is important to talk about what we are saying sorry for. In Victoria, unfortunately, it's a little hard to know where to start. Such was the swift, brutal and systematic nature of attempts to wipe out Aboriginal people, to wipe out their culture, their language, their children and their future. Speaker, many of my ancestors arrived in the mid-1800s, mostly Irish Catholics escaping famine, oppression and the law. Many in this place, I imagine, have a similar family history. Just a few years before this, in 1839, two Aboriginal men from Lutruwita, Tasmania, Tunnerminnerwait and Mulbohina, were brought to the colony of Victoria. In 1841, they were among a group of guerrilla resistance fighters who fought throughout Victoria. A year later, they were caught and convicted of the murder of two whale hunters, and they became the first people to be hanged in Melbourne, in public, to communicate a political message to Aboriginal people considering armed resistance to colonisation. A memorial to these two men sits just down the road from this building, but most of us weren't taught this history because it didn't fit the narrative that our predecessors wanted to tell about this country. That Victoria's colonisation was not peaceful, it was brutal. Growing up, I was taught a story that I think would be fairly common to many of us in this room, of the frontier, of struggle, of Australia providing a place of peace and freedom and opportunity. But this peace and freedom and opportunity was not granted to Victoria's original inhabitants. Quite the opposite. We weren't taught about 1842, when 6 settlers in Western Victoria found a group of Gaiwurrung and Djabwurrung families sleeping under a clump of tea tree and then shot them, killing a boy and 4 women, one of whom was pregnant. And historians believe that the massacre was premeditated and carried out simply to relieve the boredom of a summer evening. And when 2 survivors reported the incident all the way up to the decision makers in Melbourne, the perpetrators faced trial for only 1 count of murder and were swiftly declared not guilty by a jury. We weren't taught about what happened in 1834 when a whale washed up at the beach at Portland, and when the Gunditj clan members went to collect the meat, as they had done for thousands of years, they were massacred by white settlers who wanted the whale for themselves, killing around 60 people with no one held to account. I certainly wasn't taught about the story that we found hidden in tiny print in a copy of my husband's family history book, where it mentioned his great-great-great-aunt who kept the blacks at bay with muskets on the farm in Western Victoria. As the Minister mentioned, there are at least 50 massacres across Victoria that are officially recorded in historical evidence, showing that people knew, governments knew, and now we all know. And that is why today we say sorry. Speaker, I feel very fortunate having grown up with parents who lived in and worked in communities in the Tiwi Islands and in Bantu Alice Springs, that I received perhaps more of an education about our true history than many people of my generation. But as a child and a teenager, it was still hard to make sense of what I saw around me. Why was it that the Aboriginal kids in my town went to one school while the white kids mostly went to another? Why was it that so many Aboriginal people were sent to live on the outskirts of town on particular streets where few white people ever ventured? Why was it that my best friend in high school didn't find out she was Aboriginal until she was a teenager because her family told everyone her grandmother was Italian rather than admit that she was Aboriginal? Why was it that my mum was told when she was a child that there were no Aboriginal people in Gippsland? Why was it that Aboriginal people had such immensely worse outcomes in health, education, and were so overrepresented in the justice and child protection systems? It wasn't because, as the Uluru Statement from the Heart pointed out, there is something inherently different about First Nations people. These inequalities, this shame, was created as a result of 190 years of deliberate decisions and deliberate actions, and then a concerted effort to hide and erase this history. And it isn't just the massacres that we're apologising for today. It's the racist policies of the past, many enacted in this very building. The children stolen from their parents, the human remains stolen from graves as curiosities, the forcing of Aboriginal people onto missions and reserves, and then the passing of a law in 1865 that prohibited people on these missions from voting. The people forced into slavery-like conditions and never paid the wages owed to them. The Act of Parliament passed here in 1869 that gave the state power to determine who people could marry, where they could work, and what they could do with their earnings. These are not things that are a matter of opinion. They are matters of fact. They happened. I encourage people as we sit in this place to look at the ceiling. That's 24-carat gold leaf decorating the walls and ceiling of this building. Since 1851, more than $290 billion worth of gold was extracted from Victoria. But as Yurok heard, First Peoples have never received any of that wealth. Not only that, but deliberate policies enacted in this building covered in gold, meant that Aboriginal people were not even allowed to own land, let alone pass that wealth on to their children. Those who committed these atrocities, who made these decisions, were overwhelmingly never held to account or brought to justice for their actions. But it is us, non-Aboriginal Victorians, who overwhelmingly benefited from these policies and decisions. We cannot go back in time and undo what has been done, but we can admit that it was deeply, profoundly wrong and apologise. And there is a power in accepting that this is part of our history and then doing something to change it. That's why it was a privilege to vote yes to treaty 6 weeks ago, to embark on a different and more hopeful path, to hand back some of the power to First Nations communities, to have ownership over their own affairs so that things can be better in the future. And today is not only about saying sorry, but committing to do better. So it would be negligent to ignore the fact that this apology comes during a time that is very difficult for many First Nations people. Last week, the Victorian Government passed laws to introduce life sentences for children and put children through the adult court system, which we know will have a disproportionate impact on First Nations children. Ngara Murray, co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly, put it eloquently when she said, "Our peoples are already over-policed and over-represented in prison populations. Aboriginal communities will again bear the brunt of the government's proposed changes, which will result in Aboriginal children being locked up in prison and kept away from their families for longer." We know Aboriginal women are also already bearing the brunt of the government's recent changes to bail laws, where the rate of First Nations women being held in prison before trial has risen drastically. Sue Ann Hunter, the National Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, has called the recent youth justice laws a moral failure that will have a resounding impact for the next generation and beyond. Looking back now at Victoria's true history, back to the actions of people in the 1800s, the 1900s, I believe most of us in this place would be horrified and say people should have known better. Right now, we cannot deny it, we do know better. I fear that in 10 or 20 years' time, a new Parliament will have to stand in this exact same place and apologise again for policies enacted this year that governments knew would destroy more First Nations people's lives. Speaker, many people deeply affected by the effects of colonisation did not live to see this apology. So as we take this important step in acknowledging and apologising for the wrongs of the past, we think of them. We think of the old people who endured so much, those who survived to share their culture with us and those who didn't. But we also think of the young people, the future. And it is for their sake that we must not allow ourselves to repeat the same mistakes of the past. This apology is an important step for all of us. It is a first. I sincerely hope it will not be needed again. I commend the motion.
Thank